They had killed about 135 Japanese in the process of taking the islands. While the Marines were surrounding Roy and Namur with guns, Admiral Connolly's ships were bombarding the two islands all day long. On the night of D-Day, 3 destroyers kept up the pressure, firing star shells and explosive at the two islands to keep the Japanese off balance and prevent them from getting any sleep. The main attack would come at dawn. The 23rd Regimental Combat Team would land on the southern beaches of Roy, and the 24th Regimental Combat Team would land on the southern beaches of Namur. All this was to be accomplished by use of the vessels the Americans had developed, especially for amphibious landings. Key to these was the landing ship, Tank, a squat transport with shallow draft that was capable of coming in close to the beach under normal conditions, and landing vehicles and men through its bow, which opened like a trap door. Inside the landing ship, Tank in these reef conditions, the Marines boarded landing vehicle, Tank, amphibious tractors. The landing ship, Tank, then moved into the lagoon as dawn neared, while the warships outside began the barrage. Admiral Turner saw the small area to be attacked, and from his readings of the aerial photographs, he predicted that Roy Namur was going to be a tougher nut to crack than Tarawa had been how tough a nut remained to be seen. The barrage began again at 6:50 a.m., but the landing forces were having trouble. A number of the landing vehicle Tank used the day before had sunk in the surf. Some had gotten lost in the darkness instead of finding their proper landing ship, Tank. There were not enough to go around, and landing craft, vehicles and personnel had to be brought up instead, so the landings, scheduled for 10 that morning, were postponed for an hour. Meanwhile, the Navy ships offshore were blasting the islands with everything that could shoot. Their targets were there on the maps: 6 artillery positions, 8 blockhouses, 65 pillboxes, and about 200 buildings, including 2 aircraft hangars on Roa. Whatever was in those hangars represented the only Japanese air power in the Marshalls. Not a single plane was in shape to fly, and there were no enemy air attacks. At Tarawa, one of the Marines' most bitter complaints was that the Navy had stood off 10 miles and fired at random, which they never hit. At Roy Namur, the cruisers moved in to just a mile off the beach, and the battleships, with their deeper draft, stood off only 3,500 yards. By naval standards, this was point-blank range. Half an hour before the new time set for hitting the beach, torpedo and dive bombers from the carriers Cabot and Intrepid bombed the two islands, and a wave of fighters swept along the beaches, strafing. Admiral Mitcher was following Admiral Spruance's ideas on use of carriers to support landing operations, no matter how he felt about it. The strike completed, the aircraft were warned away and the barrage began again. So intensive was this battering that the Marine air observers, hieing around in light planes to direct spot bombing, said they could not see a thing on either of the islands because of the smoke and dust raised by bombs and shells. Just offshore, the Marines milled about in their vessels, and some units had lost communication with higher command. Their radios had been drenched in salt water and failed. The doors of one landing ship, Tank, jammed, and the smaller vessels could not be brought out. The idea was that the landing ship, Tank, would open up and the landing vehicle, Tank, would come out and form up into waves to land, but several landing vehicle, Tank of one group got lost and had to be found. So the minutes passed and the Marines were still not on the beach. By 11 a.m. this confusion became a matter of concern to Admiral Connolly. One purpose of his intense barrage that morning had been to stun the enemy so that the Marines could land while the defenders were still in a state of shock. But the longer it continued, the more used to the gunfire the Japanese must become. Further, the small landing vehicles had limited fuel storage, and it was unthinkable that an invasion should be held up until the boats ran out of gas. In the case of landing vehicle Tank, it was dangerous. These vessels shipped a lot of water and were kept afloat by pumps working all the time. But if they ran out of gas, pumps quit, and the landing vehicle, Tank, would sink, taking down their tanks, so something had to be done in a hurry. Offshore in his flagship, the Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance followed the delays imperturbably, at least as far as anyone around him could tell. Spruance's greatest asset was his unflappability. He had planned this invasion, then turned it over to subordinates he trusted, and now he was not going to interfere with them unless the need came for a major command decision. Not far away rode the Rocky Mount, Admiral Turner's flagship. His communications with the fleet were excellent. The ship was one of the new communications command ships designed to meet the needs of this war. Turner, too, listened but did not interfere. It was Admiral Connolly's show until he got General Schmidt's men ashore and established. If they wanted any advice, they would ask for it. They did not. They decided not to wait for all the forces to assemble in the proper ranks and sent the first wave in a quarter hour after the 11H hour. First went the armoured amphibious vehicles, carrying 37mm guns and .30 caliber machine guns with which they sprayed the shore as they came close. Landing craft, infantry gunboats were around them, firing guns and rockets at the beach. Behind came the infantry and the tanks. On Roy, the first to land were the men of the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines. They hit Red Beach 2, and the 2nd Battalion hit Red Beach 3 on their right. Ahead of them, the armoured amphibians ground ashore and kept on going without a hitch, up to the first anti-tank trench, which stopped them. By noon, the first 2 waves of infantry had landed on Roy. The smoke was so thick that observers on the ships offshore could not see them, and the troops could scarcely see in front of them. On Namur, on the other side of the causeway, the 3rd Battalion of the 24th Marines landed on Green Beach 1 at about the same time. The 2nd Battalion on Green Beach 2 was a little faster in coming in. The invasion was launched. The island of Roy had been so blasted by naval artillery and bombs that it looked like a wasteland. The majority of the 3,700 defenders of the Roy Namur had been killed by the bombardment, although the Marines did not know this at the time. What they saw as they came up were slow-moving, apparently punch-drunk defenders who hardly seemed capable of fighting. There were no obstacles on the beaches, and the only difficulty was with the anti-tank ditch just behind the beach. Soon, as the tanks came ashore, they found a spot where the gunfire had filled in the ditch and went across. On the other side of the ditch, they formed into a line and clattered toward their first objective, the airfield. Behind them came the infantry, and some of the infantrymen were ready to declare a little war of their own. A number of the armoured amphibians had stopped at the shoreline and let the troops go on through, then given them support fire from behind. Some Marines were shot by their own guns, and their buddies suggested that the amphibians were more dangerous than the Japanese. As for the Japanese enemy, the invasion of Roy was proceeding in a manner that would please even Howling Mad Smith, that spirited taskmaster, as the bombardment had been spectacularly successful. The infantry moved up slowly, investigating every foot of ground. They had been told repeatedly of the tricks of the Japanese at Tarawa, hiding in abandoned vehicles, playing dead, and then firing on the Marines from behind. They were taking no chances. Still in half an hour, tanks and troops had reached the first day objective, a line some 200 yards inland from the beach. The 2nd Battalion tanks faced a dilemma there. Ahead were anti-tank guns in the blockhouses, according to the intelligence they had. If they stayed on the line in the open, they would be sitting ducks for the enemy. They radioed Colonel Louis R. Jones, the commander of the 23rd, asking for permission to move ahead. The air was full of interference, and the message never got through. The tanks started up and began to move anyhow. On their left, the men of the 1st Battalion also reached this line, and they had expected rough going at Wendy Point, where the enemy had built a group of pillboxes. But when they got there, the pillboxes were holes in the ground, so they went on, and soon met up with the 2nd Battalion and forged ahead onto the airfield runway. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, they had gotten through to Colonel Jones. He shared their elation at the easy going and radioed to General Schmidt aboard the flagship. "Give us the word, and we will take the rest of the island." When General Schmidt had that message, he was more concerned than relieved, for he was also told that the tanks and the troops had moved beyond the first objective line and scattered. Until they were reassembled, there was no way an assault could be made against the north half of the island, where the bulk of the enemy were presumed to be. He told Colonel Jones to settle down and get his troops back to the line and under control. The process took nearly 2 hours. The Marines of the 4th Division had not been in combat before, and now it all seemed so easy they were bent on getting a Jap and taking some souvenirs in the process. But by 3 in the afternoon they were brought back, and the attack could continue in order. Company F moved forward against a concrete building that had been untouched by the bombardment, although the buildings all around it were rubble. A Marine moved cautiously up to the steel door, kicked it open, and tossed in a grenade while his companions covered his progress with a hail of fire from M1 rifles. The grenade exploded and he looked inside. He found one dead Japanese. The battalion continued to move. Soon the troops came to a blockhouse, 3 feet of reinforced concrete in the walls. It had been hit by naval shells and bombs, but was far from demolished. Lieutenant Colonel Edward J. Dillon, the battalion commander, asked for a dive-bombing attack on the blockhouse, but was turned down because the troops were too close. He ordered Company G to take the position. First, a 75mm half-track was sent up to fire against the steel door. The half-track had fired 5 rounds when a demolition squad came up. The half-track continued to fire, and the demolition men put charges at the ports and Bangalore torpedoes through the shell holes in the roof. When they exploded, the infantry came up and tossed grenades, and then the troops entered. They found 3 heavy machine guns, a large supply of ammunition, and 3 dead Japanese soldiers. They also discovered that the Japanese had built their defences for an attack from the sea. The 3 gun ports faced north, east and west. There was no gun port at the south, toward the lagoon, through which the Marines had come. Eastward from this blockhouse ran a system of trenches and machine gun positions that looked down on the beach. Here was the centre of Japanese resistance on Roy. The Marines moved along the trenches and killed a number of Japanese, but they found far more already dead. Had the bombardment not been so effective, their task would have been far more difficult. As it was, most of the resistance was concentrated in pillboxes and blockhouses that had remained more or less intact. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the 2nd Battalion had taken its objectives and settled down. The 1st Battalion moved on along the west coast of the island and found a few scattered riflemen who fought until they were killed. In one trench they discovered 50 enemy soldiers, all dead from the bombardment, and by 6 that night they too had secured their positions and stopped. All that remained for the next day's work was the mop-up of the small pocket of Japanese troops that remained in the centre of the airfield. After dark, somebody fired off a gun, and then there was a rash of firing on Roy, and the officers managed to quiet the men down, then investigated. It was not enemy, but trigger-happy Marines. Luckily, no harm was done, and the Marines on Roy settled down for a quiet night. Namur was a different story. The confusion of landing hurt the 24th Regimental Combat Team more than it had the Marines of Roy, for only about 60 of the 110 landing vehicle, tank assigned to move the troops that morning, could be found. The troops had to come in higgledy-piggledy, which was an affront to any trained amphibious officer, but in this case the confusion was not particularly harmful. The bombardment had done its job, and resistance on the beach was very slight, and the troops moved up to anti-tank ditches similar to those on Roe. In a quarter of an hour, the men of the 24th had moved 200 yards inland, except on the extreme right, where the Japanese had built a line of resistance and were manning it. The ease of their movement was illusory, for Namur held most of the troops defending the northern Kwajalein base. Nor had the bombardment been as effective on this island as it was on Roy, because the vegetation of Namur was heavy, and although many buildings were knocked down, the Japanese found hiding places in the brush. Companies I and K came first, and one of the first things they noticed was that the fire of the enemy was almost totally uncoordinated. Back at San Diego, they had been warned of the Japanese expertise at building interlocking fields of fire, but in the marshals there seemed to be none of this, to the great relief of the Americans. Companies I and K moved along, and Company B, the reserve, came in afternoon and mopped up small pockets of resistance that remained. Much of the difficulty they faced was American-made. The company had 3 tanks, but 2 of them bogged down in the sand churned up by the long bombardment, and the 3rd slid into a shell hole and slipped a track. They were not destroyed, but for the moment they were out of action. Luckily, the assault companies of the 3rd Battalion did not need them that morning and early afternoon, after they came in from Green Beach 1. On Green Beach 2, Companies E and F had almost the same experience, some difficulties caused by the bombardment's effects. few caused by the enemy. By 1 in the afternoon, the Marines on both beaches had reached their first objective. Before them, on the southeast or right side, was Sally Point, the southeast promontory of Namur. In planning, the Marines had expected a strong resistance here, for the point commanded the beaches around it, but again the effects of the bombardment had been felt. The Marines found only 2 machine guns on Sally Point and cleared those out in a hurry. Early afternoon, then, found the Marines moving right ahead on Namur with little indication of trouble. Then a Marine demolition team moved to a large building that looked like a blockhouse, and for some time the ship's guns had been silent. The fleet was ready to fire on any target given it, so thoroughly had the Navy been briefed after Tarawa. But the troop commander called for a ceasefire because the Marines were moving too fast. Shortly after noon, all the ships had quit firing, and the only artillery heard was that of the Marine guns on the surrounding islands. At 12:50 p.m, they were supposed to complete their bombardment as well. The troops were told that from this point on they would have to rely on their own field weapons. Since the blockhouse represented a definite threat to the advance of Company F of the 2nd Battalion, the demolition men were told to bring down the building. They crept forward under cover from the riflemen and placed a shaped charge, plastic explosive, against the side of the building, then retreated. When they blew the charge, it tore a hole in the building, and one demolition man moved up with a 16-pound satchel charge and tossed it in. Immediately the building blew up with an enormous roar and a cloud of smoke that ran hundreds of feet into the air. Debris began falling all over the island. "The whole damn island has blown up," shouted a Marine observer who was riding in a torpedo plane above the island. As the debris rained down on the 2nd Battalion command post, someone shouted, "Gas," and the Marines began fumbling for gas masks most had discarded on the beaches as too much trouble to carry. But it was not gas, as investigation later showed. It was the explosion of the airbase's aerial torpedo supply dump, containing scores, perhaps hundreds, of long-lance torpedoes. The building might have been blown up by a stray shell from a late firing gun. It might have been blown up by heroic Japanese defenders, determined not to be captured, but probably it was blown up by the satchel charge. Down on the troops came chunks of reinforced concrete, twisted pieces of steel that had the impact of shrapnel and the exploding torpedoes. 20 Marines were killed by the concussion or by falling debris, another 80 were wounded, and a few minutes later came 2 more explosions, either triggered by the first or caused by the Japanese defenders. More Marines fell, and more important to the invasion, communications between the battalion command post and the line companies was destroyed. From that point on, Lieutenant Colonel Francis H. Brink, the battalion commander, had to rely on runners to keep in touch. The explosions, stopping the Americans for the first time, seemed to put heart into the Japanese. All along the line the sound of the small-caliber Japanese rifles could be heard, and the characteristic pop-pop of the Japanese light machine guns joined in. As the Americans stopped to reorganize and were in position for 2 hours, the Japanese had a chance to reorganize their own defenses. They began to fight with determination. Colonel Franklin A. Hart, the regimental commander, hoped to capture the entire island before the end of the day. It was already growing late, but at 4:30 in the afternoon the troops seemed ready to make the push to the north shore that would complete the task. And this time, however, the ground was contested. The tanks moved ahead, and the infantry was supposed to move right along with them to protect the flanks. But the Marines often found themselves ducking behind fallen palms and other debris, and searching for snipers in the brush, in the debris of buildings, in the trees ahead, and sometimes behind them. Some of the tanks got ahead of the troops, and then there was apt to be trouble. The command tank of Company B of the 4th Tank Battalion got out ahead of troops and its own tanks, and had stopped to reconnoitre when Captain James L. Denegue realized that he was alone. Out of the brush ran half a dozen Japanese, straight for the tank. One of them dropped a grenade into the open port of the turret, and it exploded inside, killing the driver and wounding Captain Denegue mortally. The infantrymen who had fallen behind came up then and killed the Japanese. The tanks had no difficulty in penetrating, and some of them reached the road on the north shore the Marines called Narcissus Street. This road ran parallel to the shoreline, about 100 yards in from the beach. It became the last Japanese defence line that day. Darkness fell as the Marines came up to the road, and they were ordered to stop and dig in for the night. As the old hands knew, it was more than unfortunate that the island could not be taken in the daylight hours, for that night the Japanese harassed the troops. Those who had been bypassed came out to fight, which meant they were behind the lines. Those on the other side of the North Shore Road began to infiltrate, and there were a number of foxhole fights for life. At dawn, about 100 Japanese came charging against a weak spot in the line where Company Wund and Company B had lost contact. In this banzai charge, a Japanese grenade came hurtling into a position occupied by half a dozen Marines. Private Richard K. Sorensen saw it come and covered the grenade with his own body. It blew up, but miraculously Sorensen was only wounded, not killed, and the others were saved. Sorensen received the Congressional Medal of Honor for this act of bravery. Medium tanks had been landed the day before on Roai to support the 23rd Marines' attack on the airfield. They were brought up this morning to Namur and led the drive to clear the island. It was accomplished by 2 in the afternoon on February 2. When the fighting ended after 2.5 days, the Marines assessed their casualties and those of the enemy. They had suffered 190 dead and 547 wounded. The Japanese garrison had been almost completely wiped out, with 3,472 enemy dead counted, and 51 prisoners of war plus 40 Korean labourers who surrendered. As it turned out, by the time the Americans attacked, the garrison at Roy Namur was smaller than expected, about 1,000 less than at Tarawa. But the relative ease of the operation was in large part due to the enormous effort of the Navy in bombarding the small islands before the troops landed. When it was all over, naval officers began to refer to the Roy Namur assault as the perfect one. Perhaps one of the reasons that Admiral Turner did not interfere at all with Admiral Connolly's conduct of the Roy Namur invasion was that he was personally supervising the invasion of Kwajalein Island at the southern end of the atoll, and by D-Day he had his hands full. At 11 p.m. on the night of January 30, the destroyer transports Overton and Manly moved into Gia Pass, the entrance through the coral reef to the southern part of Kwajalein's lagoon. Each destroyer was carrying 155 men of the Army's 7th Division, picked men who would capture the islands in the next few hours. After some confusion because of the darkness and seas made choppy by the trade wind, those troops assigned to Gea Island reached shore about daylight. They found no resistance as they beached the rubber boats and moved inland. At the northwest corner of the island they did see an observation tower, and they flushed one Japanese soldier who was killed. But as they came down the south side of the island, the Americans suddenly came under fire. Second Lieutenant Claude Hornbarker ordered his men to set up a machine gun in the crotch of a tree and lay down fire on the whole area. Sergeant Leonard Brink moved forward and found the Japanese ensconced in a shell crater. He began hurling grenades into the crater, while the machine gun fired over his head, after the resistance seemed to slacken and the return grenade fire stopped. Brink led other members of the platoon into the crater with knives and bayonets. When the struggle ended, 19 Japanese soldiers were dead and 1 American was wounded. That action was the only important resistance on Gea. A few more Japanese were killed singly, and then the island was secure. Moving against the neighbouring island of Nina, the second force became disoriented and landed on Gea, the next islet on the west. A garrison of about 125 Japanese was stationed here, and the American landing party ran into resistance. They stopped near a Japanese tugboat stranded on the beach and radioed General Corlett, who told them to get over to Nina. Captain Paul Gritter, the leader of the landing party, left a detachment under Captain Gilbert Drexel on Gea and went to Nina, which was unoccupied, so the channel was protected. The troops left on Gea were attacked by the Japanese, but they held them off until reinforcements could be brought in to clear the island. It was a hard task, hardest of all during the preliminary fighting, because the Japanese outnumbered the Americans and kept renewing their attacks. The next 2 islands to be taken before the major assault on Kwajalein were Enilabagan and Enubuj, the former to become a supply dump for the infantry, and the latter to house the divisional artillery of a dozen 155mm howitzers and 8 105mm howitzers. These were much larger than the other islands just taken. Inubuj was 2/3 of a mile long, although only 300 yards wide. Enilabagan was occupied easily. Only a handful of Japanese were found there, and they were eliminated without any American casualties. But on Inubuj, the soldiers expected stiff opposition, and 4 assault waves were landed on the small island. It was something of an anticlimax when they met absolutely no opposition. They came charging ashore, rocket grenadiers, flamethrower men, wire specialists, and demolition crews. The gunboats offshore battered the island as the troops came in, and carrier planes bombed and strafed. They brought in self-propelled howitzers. They moved cautiously up the island, expecting counterattack at any moment. They captured 21 Korean labourers, and that was all. The Japanese had fled to Kwajalein. Before the scheduled time, then, the division artillery was unloaded on Inubuj, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon it was zeroing in on Kwajalein. That afternoon and evening the big guns fired sporadically on the enemy island to keep the Japanese off balance. On the afternoon and evening of January 31, the troops of the 7th Division moved from their transports into landing ship Tank. The invaders were ready for anything. They sent underwater demolition teams in to destroy obstacles and mines, but there were none. It all looked very easy, but so hard had been the lessons of Tarawa that aboard the Rocky Mount, Admiral Turner and his subordinates did not really believe it would turn out to be so simple. All night long, the artillery on Inubuj and the ships offshore kept up irregular fire. At sunrise, just after 7 in the morning, the ships began the heaviest bombardment that any bit of land had yet suffered in the Pacific War. At one time, 2 shells a second were hitting in some areas, and the battleships were firing 14-inch armour-piercing shells that raised havoc with the concrete blockhouses. The cruisers were firing their 8-inch guns with deadly effect on lesser targets. Battleships, cruisers and destroyers were firing 5-inch guns, loaded with high-explosive shells that tore up the brush and palm timber fortifications. That day the ships fired 7,000 shells against the 3-mile-long island. The divisional artillery fired 29,000 rounds of 105mm and 155mm ammunition. The 3 escort carriers and 3 carriers from the Fast Carrier Task Force were supposed to fly hundreds of sorties against the island, but bad weather set in early in the day, and Admiral Turner cancelled air operations. He was a battleship man who believed that airplanes should be used to protect ships and attack ships, but that the role of attack against installations should belong to the warships. In this sense, Admiral Turner was typical of the black shoe sailors, who had not yet appreciated the role of air power in this Pacific War. By nightfall, 3 battalions of the 184th Regimental Combat Team and another 3 battalions of the 32nd Regimental Combat Team had boarded landing ship Tank and were waiting. Before dawn on February 1, they were awakened and got ready, blacking their faces to mask that telltale patch of skin and checking their weapons. At 6 o'clock they filed below to the amphibious tractors that would carry them to shore. 10 minutes passed, and then the battleships opened up again with their big guns, and the clamour became deafening. The barrage continued until 7:45 a.m. Heavy Army Air Force bombers from Tarawa arrived over the beaches to drop 2,000-pound bombs. Dive bombers from the carriers followed them. Torpedo bombers came in low with fragmentation bombs. F-6F fighter planes followed, strafing. Then the battleships began firing again on the beaches. During the bombardment, the landing ship, Tank had opened their doors, and the Amphtrax, amphibious tractors, had come forth to begin circling as they waited for the moment to move in. They would land on the west end of the croissant-shaped island, the 184th Regimental Combat Team on the north and the 32nd south of them. By 9:15 a.m. they were beginning to move, and the landing craft infantry gunboats were ahead of them, spraying the beaches with gunfire and rockets. As the landing force neared the beaches, there was no question about the presence of the Japanese here, and from the shore came fire from field guns, machine guns, and mortars. As they approached, it seemed impossible that anything could be living in that wasteland of rubble, shattered trees, and torn-up earth and sand. But from the shell holes and the wreckage came small arms fire. In spite of the bombardment, some of the pillboxes had survived and were manned by gunners. The shelling was moved from the beach inland as the Amphtrax approached the surf. At 9:30 a.m. the first wave landed, and the troops ran over a dune and to shelter behind a wrecked seawall. Soon they were formed up. "Why, it's just like a maneuver," exclaimed one soldier, but there was a difference. Men did not fall and die in maneuvers, and although the Japanese were badly battered and their ranks decimated by the bombardment, they were still shooting and wounding and killing soldiers on the beach, but the waves came on. Before noon, the troops had moved inland 150 yards, and the beachhead was secure. A few pillboxes had withstood the bombardment, and these were worked over with demolition charges and flamethrowers. The worst problem was with the vehicles on the beaches. The tanks were stalled by the wrecked seawall, fell into shell craters, were caught from underneath by logs and the stumps of palms. The troops stopped at the edge of the road that encircled the island, and here ran basically north and south. Ahead of them lay a broad area of marshland covered with thick brush, and to the north a palm forest. They cleared some Japanese, and some others remained hidden in underground shelters and let them pass, waiting for an opportunity to strike heavier blows than they could against the onrush. The heaviest resistance was met by the 184th Infantry's 3rd Battalion, which encountered several pillboxes manned by the enemy. Company K landed on the northwest corner of the island, and the men had moved only about 25 yards inland when they came under fire from a pillbox. Private First Class Paul Roper and Private Parvy Raspberry were in this advance wave. They wriggled up to a shell hole and crawled in. Ahead of them, 15 yards away, was the pillbox. With its gun port spitting fire, they began throwing grenades. The Japanese threw them back, and this game continued for several minutes, until another soldier came up with a flamethrower. They turned the flame against the pillbox, but it hit the concrete and bounced back, and Private Raspberry then crawled out of the crater and up to the pillbox. From a point 5 yards away, he threw a white phosphorus smoke grenade into the port. The grenade exploded and hushed a dozen Japanese from the pillbox. The riflemen of the company began shooting at them and killed several, and the others rushed back into the pillbox. Raspberry threw another smoke grenade, but this time they stayed inside. Raspberry kept them busy, throwing smoke grenades until he ran out. Tech Sergeant Graydon Kickle of Company L came up and managed to crawl to the pillbox and get on top of it. He emptied his M1 in a sweeping motion inside the port, and there was silence inside the pillbox. To make sure the enemy was dead, he beckoned up an amphibian tank, equipped with a 37mm gun and a flamethrower. The tank blew its flame into the port and fired the 37mm gun. That general technique became the method of flushing the pillboxes, and they were neutralized one by one. When this was done, the assault troops of Company L and Company 1 moved through the area, and Company K, which had borne the brunt of the early fighting, went into reserve. The first objective taken with the attainment of the road, the 2 battalions in assault pointed toward the second objective, a road running north and south near the airstrip that dominated the centre of the island. The resistance stiffened here. On the south, the 32nd's 2nd Battalion took over the assault. Soon the troops came under fire from 3 pillboxes. Actually, those points had been passed earlier by the 1st Battalion, but the Japanese had feigned death, and after a quick look, the troops of the 1st Battalion had ignored the abandoned pillboxes until the enemy riflemen began firing later in the day. At that point, the 2nd Battalion had to stop and clear out each pillbox with the assistance of tanks. North of the 32nd's drive, the 184th Regimental Combat Team's 3rd Battalion also encountered stiffer resistance. The troops came upon a big bunker made of reinforced concrete and palm logs. It resisted the effects of flamethrowers, so the demolition men came up with charges and white phosphorus that created dense choking smoke to drive the Japanese out. By 3 in the afternoon, the 184th had reached the north-south connecting road, called Wilmer Road, and turned south to link up with the 32nd. The next step would be to take the airfield, and by late afternoon the invasion was totally secure. About 11,000 troops were ashore, and supplies were coming in steadily from the ships without difficulty. The absence of a single Japanese aircraft all day long was a blessing for which the invaders could thank the Fast Carrier Task Force and Admiral Hoover's land-based Air Force. Had this been a marine invasion, perhaps in late afternoon, those 11,000 men would have surged into action to storm the airfield. In his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, Samuel Eliot Morison so indicates an implied criticism of the Army's way of fighting. But the Army was doing very well, particularly in the face of mounting Japanese resistance. The defenders had built strong fortifications on the lagoon and ocean sides of the airfield to protect the runways. 3 coastal defence positions had been built on the south or ocean side of the island. The Japanese had also cleared away the palms around this area to give them open fields of fire. But from the north-south road back several hundred yards, the Japanese retired swiftly in the south. On the northern side, the 184th ran into more difficulty from enemy troops in prepared positions. They were stopped by an explosion. A shell fired from Enubuj Island had ignited a fuel dump, and it went up with a roar. But around 4 in the afternoon, the 32nd was also slowed when Company E encountered positions that were connected by underground tunnels. The Japanese would defend a position until the Americans were virtually on top of them, and then disappear. The farther the Americans moved toward the centre of the island, the tougher the defence became. At 6 that evening, the assault was stopped for the night, and the troops dug in. The 3rd Battalion of the 184th had encountered far more enemy resistance than had the 32nd, but the 3rd Battalion had suffered only 10 men killed and 13 wounded. The 32nd Regimental Combat Team had 7 killed and 23 wounded. They had killed about 500 Japanese defenders and taken 11 prisoners. So although by naval standards the army was slow, the caution had paid off in low casualties on this first day of the invasion. The high number of enemy dead had to be attributed in large part to the effective bombardment of Admiral Turner's warships, and in all it had been a satisfactory first day. The troops had occupied about a quarter of the island and were thoroughly organised. The next day they could begin to deal with the estimated 1,500 Japanese defenders who remained on the island. That night, the problem was to protect the perimeter and prevent the Japanese from launching banzai attacks that could cause many casualties. The divisional artillery was given the job of providing harassing fire that night. General Charles Corlett moved ashore with his staff to a command post on Enubuj Island. On Kwajalein, the troops dug foxholes and waited. It began to rain, a chill, pelting rain that soaked the men in their foxholes. After dark, the Japanese began to move. Several Japanese guns at the northern tip of the island began firing into the area. The destroyer Sigsbee had been detailed to keep a searchlight trained on the airfield for the first half of every hour. This light bothered the enemy and brought an attempt to knock it out. Sigsbee was standing offshore in the lagoon, and an anti-aircraft gun was depressed to fire on the destroyer. The anti-aircraft gun was knocked out by the Sigsbee's 5-inch gun. The Japanese brought up a replacement, and it was silenced. The Japanese then turned field pieces on the destroyer from Ebai Island, north of Kwajalein, but they were no more effective. The troops ashore kept the area illuminated with star shells and flares to keep the Japanese off balance. The ships offshore were shooting again, which helped do the same, but the enemy came out anyhow, in small groups, attempting to infiltrate the American lines. At 1:30 in the morning, the Japanese launched a larger attack against Company L of the 184th Regimental Combat Team. The attack began with mortar shelling on the machine gun positions, which the Japanese had spotted earlier in the evening. 3 well-placed mortar shells fell on one 50-caliber machine gun position, wounding several men and killing one. The Japanese then attacked, and the platoon withdrew, and the Japanese attacked the next platoon, but another heavy machine gun fired into them and stopped the attack. It was a momentary flurry, and reinforcements came up, but by the time they arrived the action was over. Still, Japanese harassing fire continued all during the hours of darkness. Their mortars were particularly effective. Their targets were the machine guns and anti-tank guns. They struck again at Company L, knocking out another machine gun that had been sent up to replace the one destroyed earlier. They dropped a shell beneath an anti-tank gun, disabling the gun, killing 2 men, and wounding another, so the night was anything but restful for the men of the 7th Division. On the morning of February 2, General Corlett ordered a coordinated attack by the 2 regimental combat teams. An artillery barrage would begin at 7 a.m. and the troops would get ready. After 15 minutes of general fire, the guns on Enubuj would concentrate on specific targets. At 8 a.m., the carrier planes would strike along the line. The troops would be already moving. On the northern side, in the 184th's area, the 2nd Battalion began the attack. The 1st Battalion came along close behind in support. On the southern ocean side, the 32nd Regimental Combat Team's 2nd Battalion also advanced, after the artillery and the navy guns had laid down a barrage. The 184th troops advanced about 200 yards before they encountered much opposition. At first they came under sniper fire from Japanese hidden in the ruins of buildings and among fallen logs. They passed the central pier that had served the airfield on the lagoon side and continued along the northern side of the airfield. Their tanks sprayed the trees ahead to knock down snipers, and tanks and 37mm guns stopped at pillboxes to reduce them. Most of the infantry would go ahead, while a few soldiers stood by the tanks as they pulled up to their objectives. A tank would begin firing on a pillbox, its machine gun trained on the entrance. If the Japanese decided to come out, they were mowed down before they could launch a banzai charge. Before 11 in the morning, this method of reducing strong points while the infantry moved on had brought the 184th to the northeast end of the airfield, and they crossed the 2nd lateral road, called Carl Road. On the ocean shore, the 32nd ran into stronger opposition that morning. They called for an airstrike when the Japanese guns on the north shore began firing on them. They moved forward then, under considerable harassment from snipers, but they too were at the northwest end of the airfield and Carl Road at 11 that morning of the 2nd day. When the 32nd's troops had come up to Carl Road, they found they faced a clearing. On the other side of it, on the south, was a strong Japanese defensive position, which began with a deep tank trap. Behind it were pillboxes, machine gun emplacements, and artillery positions, all interlaced with trenches for the Japanese infantry and more anti-tank trenches. It was apparent to the regiment's officers that the Japanese intended to make a strong stand here to prevent anyone who crossed from the west from entering the northern section of the curved island, where most of the troop installations were located. Since this would demand a maximum assault effort, the fresh 3rd Battalion of the 32nd was brought up to pass through the 2nd Battalion. The jump-off time was set at 12:45 p.m, and the assault was delayed, largely by confusion between the Navy and the Army. Admiral Turner's ship's captains were eager to deliver spot fire in support of troops, but the Army men were not totally confident in the Navy accuracy and preferred to wait for their own artillery. Since that artillery was serving both the 184th and the 32nd, sometimes the wait was long for fire on a specific point. That day, Admiral Turner decided the Army needed an airstrike on these positions in the south and ordered it for 1:30 p.m, which caused the Army to suspend its artillery fire. On the first day, an air observer and a Navy pilot had been killed when the torpedo bomber in which they were flying swooped down too low in the face of a barrage from the Army artillery and was destroyed by American shells in mid-air. So the Army was taking no chances of a repeat accident, and the assault was finally delayed until 2 in the afternoon. When the assault began, it moved slowly as the tanks tested the area and their ability to avoid the anti-tank ditch. Finally, 4 tanks made their way around the ditch on the ocean beach and opened the way. The Japanese stayed in their pillboxes and underground defences and would not come out even when the Americans overran the area. They were killed or committed self-termination inside the positions, down to a single soldier who surrendered. By the end of the day, this strong point, called Corn, was largely in American hands. In the north, the 184th advanced slowly. The regiment lent its tanks to the 32nd to assault Corn strong point, and so the advance was bogged. When the tanks came back, they were low on fuel and had to be sent to the western end of the island, where the gasoline dump was located. At the end of the 2nd day, then, the American advance had gone only about half as fast as planned. The troops were supposed to have reached the 3rd lateral road, but were only about halfway. All day long the carrier planes had been busy. Some planes were called in to attack specific strong points near the troop lines, but the Army was not particularly comfortable with Navy planes flying so close. Most of the carrier plane effort was devoted to the many installations in the northern sector of the island, where 40 tons of bombs were dropped during the day. As night fell, the commanders counted their casualties. Only 11 Americans had been killed in action, but 241 had been wounded that day. The Japanese small-caliber rifles certainly proved the strategic contention that a wounded man is at least 3 times as much trouble to his army as a dead one. And for all day long, litter squads were taking the wounded back to battalion aid stations for first aid treatment. They were then put into ambulances and carried along the roads to the shore collecting stations. The medical sections evacuated them by landing vehicle, tank to the transports, where more complete medical facilities were available. As for the enemy, the Americans could not tell for certain what the casualties might be. Their best source of information would be prisoners, one might think, but the prisoners were enlisted men, and in the Japanese army the enlisted men were told virtually nothing about tactics and dispositions. So the estimate was that somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Japanese defenders had been killed, and that the enemy was very near the end of his strength. One prisoner estimated that only 200 Japanese were still able to fight. General Corlett was sobered by this information and warned the troops to be prepared for a banzai attack. It was just this sort of situation, the Americans had learned in previous battles, that brought the Japanese to an always futile but always dangerous self-termination charge. That night, however, there were no unusual activities by the enemy. A few shells were lobbed into the American positions, and some grenades were thrown, but there was no self-termination charge. The next day, General Corlett said, must be their last. The Marines at Roy Namur had already cleared out their islands. The 7th Division must finish the job by 3 in the afternoon, and on February 3 the troops began attacking shortly after 7 in the morning. They had captured enemy maps, photographs taken by reconnaissance planes, and stories from prisoners, particularly Korean labourers. It was remarkable, however, how much information these sources did not give the Americans. They knew where the enemy buildings had been, but not which ones were still standing, nor which strong points and destroyed buildings were being used by the defenders. The Americans had turned around the crescent, so that now the line of advance was almost due north up the island. The troops of the 32nd expected to encounter 5 pillboxes and 2 artillery positions on their side, and their 3rd Battalion would lead. The troops of the 184th were not quite sure what they would meet, and after a 10-minute barrage, the soldiers began to move forward. The 32nd pressed forward 150 yards before coming against opposition, then found the going fairly easy for another 200 yards or so, until they came up to a concrete pillbox at the edge of the island's naval headquarters installations. 2 medium tanks attacked the pillbox with 75mm shells. The Japanese ran out of the pillbox and took shelter in buildings behind, although a number were shot down by American troops. Here the 32nd and the 184th were almost intermingling as their drives rubbed shoulders. The 184th took on the task of clearing the defenders from the cluster of buildings. Company L and part of Company A would do the job, so the 32nd moved on ahead, and as the 2 units moved up, a gap appeared between them. Under other conditions, this gap might have enabled the enemy to strike a forceful blow down the centre of the line, and even to envelop the forward elements. But at Kwajalein, the Japanese did not now have the force to undertake any such manoeuvre. Their defence was stubborn and deadly, but there was little they could do except shoot and die. The 184th's advance along the lagoon was led by Company B of the 1st Battalion, until they came to a concrete blockhouse. Investigation showed that this blockhouse was the centre of a major defensive position, with underground shelters clustered around it. The shelters were protected by large earth mounds, and beyond the blockhouse, among the ruins blasted by the naval and artillery barrages, stood a pair of buildings that suddenly seemed enormous to the men of the 184th. These were constructed, as they discovered later, of thick reinforced concrete, steel plates, coconut logs, and several feet of sand over all. The blockhouses and shelters had remained virtually intact in spite of the rain of explosives. Company B's 1st platoon faced the blockhouse. The platoon had come up to this point without supporting weapons, which meant they had nothing larger than a Browning automatic rifle in hand. First Lieutenant Harold Klatt, commander of the platoon, waited for a heavy gun to come up. When a 37mm anti-tank gun arrived, he sent it to fire against the blockhouse, but the light gun had absolutely no effect. Lieutenant Klatt decided to leave the stronghold for the tanks and demolition men to deal with, and ordered his men to move around the obstruction. As they did so, they broke into small groups. The Japanese, seeing that the Americans were going to bypass them, began moving out of the stronghold in an effort to make their way back to another Japanese force. The area erupted in small arms fire, the Japanese sniping at the Americans and the Americans firing back. Tanks came up and stopped before the blockhouse, but they did not fire on it. There was no one at the point to tell them what was needed. Lieutenant Klatt's platoon was out of communication with the command post, and in essence had been reduced to a group of individual squads for the moment. Meanwhile, the company's second platoon, led by Second Lieutenant Frank Kaplan, moved around the other side of the blockhouse, and when Kaplan encountered fire from a wharf on the beach and forward areas, he asked for artillery fire. Soon it began coming in, almost in the midst of the men of First Platoon. Klatt yelled at them and got them to move back behind the blockhouse to reorganize, and all this effort was without progress, and it took an hour. Captain Charles A. White, the Company B commander, came up to see why the platoons were not moving. He had spent the last hour fielding questions from the battalion command post about the slow progress. He organized a two-platoon attack led by tanks, but this attack bogged down because the tanks could not communicate with the infantry except by opening their hatches, and all this wasted more time. The blockhouse continued to slow the troops. There were many Japanese inside, and satchel charges seemed to have no more effect on the fortification than the 37mm gun had earlier. So the advance stalled again. 2 men of the first platoon kept on going, however. Sergeant Melvin Higgins and Private Arthur Contreras moved far ahead of their companions and dropped into a hellhole near 2 Japanese buildings. They radioed that they needed explosives to assault the buildings, and the company's executive officer came up with some blocks of Composition C, and they made charges by putting the explosive into gas mask carriers. Higgins and Contreras then ran forward and delivered the charges to one of the buildings. They heard the roar of the explosions, but nothing happened, and they saw 2 Japanese machine guns near one building and directed a tank to them. The tank moved forward, and a white flag came up, but the tank began firing on the guns. Higgins moved up and found a dozen Japanese in a camouflaged ditch behind the guns. All of them were dead. Whether they really meant to surrender or were only trying to trick the Americans, no one would ever know. As Higgins and Contreras moved against the shelter, so had 2 other small groups. Staff Sergeant Roland Harty and Private First Class Solteros Valenzuela came up from the 1st Platoon, and a patrol of 10 men came from the 2nd Platoon. Harty and Valenzuela approached the shelter, and Harty tossed a grenade in the door, and they sprinted back into the brush, then and waited. Just as the grenade exploded, Private First Class Harold Pratt of the 2nd Platoon came up from the other side and threw a satchel charge in the door, then ducked back to the patrol. The charge exploded and routed a stream of Japanese, who came out screaming, firing rifles, and hurling grenades at the shell holes 20 yards away where the 2nd Platoon's patrol was hiding. With the noise, Sergeant Harty and Valenzuela jumped and dove for the shell craters to join their fellow soldiers. The firefight lasted 10 minutes with guns popping and grenades flying in both directions. A Japanese machine gun opened up from somewhere behind the shelter, and other Japanese suddenly surfaced from under wreckage and behind trees. At the end of the 10 minutes, the Americans had killed all the Japanese who had come from the shelter, but the leader of the 2nd Platoon patrol, Sergeant Warren Cannerly, had been killed, and so had 2 of his men. Several others were wounded, including Valenzuela. The incident seemed to have stirred up a hornet's nest, and Japanese kept appearing in all directions and firing on the patrols. Pratt crawled back to find Captain White, who sent 2 tanks to help. The tanks soon dislodged or killed all the Japanese in the immediate area,